Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As we get started here, we'll go ahead and do introductions and all of that in just one moment. I am going to go ahead and start inviting people to join the stage, just so you know, you should see that notification come through. Feel free to go ahead and accept this. This is a little bit different than a normal, webinar. We really do enjoy doing these office hours because they're very personalized. We love for you to join and actually join the conversation and ask questions. So I'll start sending those out. In the meantime, go ahead and share in the chat where you're from, where you're joining us from, what your role is, and anything you're passionate about right now, whether it's inside or outside of work. We're always interested to hear those. I know for me, I am passionate about nice, lovely weather. Although I feel like right now it's not treating me very well. I don't know if you can tell, but with my voice, that's cold. So, but still excited for better weather for sure. Okay. So as we get started, I'll go ahead and kick us off, and then I will happily pass it over to Morgan. Really quickly, I just wanted to go through a couple of housekeeping items. After this, you will be receiving an email immediately after we close out the event, and that should include the recording in case you want to go back and listen to anything or to just touch base on some of the insight that we went through here. There are always more resources, events, other things that might be helpful to you at boardable.com. We encourage you to go there. Morgan will be providing some more specific ones as we walk through some practical insight today, but I always like to share our website's always available out there as well. And then again, like I mentioned, this is supposed to be a very interactive session. So after we get started with the introductions here, feel free to unmute yourself, ask a question, really engage with the conversation. We hope that this can be a helpful kind of discussion as we chat through different topics today. So with that, I will go ahead and introduce Morgan Carpenter. We're so grateful that she's here today, not only helping us with our office hours, since it's been a little while since we've done this, but also just being able to share her knowledge with us. So she's the founder of Carpenter Nonprofit Consulting, where she helps nonprofits every day strengthen their strategy, programs, funding. She brings some deep expertise in grants, storytelling, strategic positioning, and she holds her grant professional certified credential and is a GPA approved trainer. So we're so grateful to have her join us today and share that expertise with us. And Morgan, feel free to add anything as we jump in. I know that we have some specific topics that came up in the questions that were shared with us. So I'll let you kind of pick and choose where we start today with the conversation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lavon. Yes, and thank you for having me, and thank you to everybody who is on our call with us for being here. I'm really excited to dig into this. I think boards and governance are one of those elements of nonprofits that are easy to overlook in terms of how important they are. And I'm really, really passionate about supporting boards and helping for you to be the best that you can be. If it is okay with you, I think probably the best place for us to start is in this theme of board engagement. This one clearly struck a pretty big nerve. I think we had like 5 or 6 different questions that were around board engagement. And, this is something that is very common. And I think all of the questions really were circling around that same idea of just how can we get our board members to engage, which, if we're being real, right, if you're here, you're probably not asking this question because your board is too engaged. Nobody is around like, wow, our trustees are just like wildly over functioning and we can't figure out how to get them to calm down. Right? Usually we're struggling with the opposite. How do we get people to show up? How do we get people to participate? How can we get them to actually use the tools that we've given them and the systems that we've set up? And, I think as we're considering those questions, there's a pattern that tends to be underneath of them. I think we have a tendency to frame board engagement as a motivation issue, right? Like, how are we getting people to care more? How can we get them to show up more or do more? But I think in most cases, when you're struggling with engagement with your board, what you're actually looking at is really a design issue. How have we structured the experience of being on the board? Because it's important to remember, most people don't join a board thinking like, I can't wait to be really disengaged and unresponsive. Right? That's not the goal that we have. And so when engagement starts to drop, I'm usually trying to look at that structure first. And there's a few patterns I see that tend to show up a lot. The first one being roles, right? So not just titles, but expectations. What are we actually supposed to be doing as a board member? If the expectation is basically just show up to meetings and be supportive, people will do that, right? They're going to show up, they'll nod, and then they're going to go back to their lives, not because they are disengaged necessarily, but because that is the job that you gave to them. So the shift there is getting more specific, right? Not just serve on a committee, but also what are you contributing to? What are you responsible for between meetings? Because I think that level of clarity can really drive participation. Another one that I see happening a lot, and this one is really big, is that we're not actually providing enough meaningful work for our boards to engage in. Sometimes they're not disengaged so much as being underutilized. So I think if you've got meetings that are mostly updates, if decisions are already sort of have been made prior to the board showing up to the meeting, there's not really a lot left for them to do. And if there's nothing for them to do, your engagement is going to drop every time, right? So I think, it's just remembering that people don't engage with information, they engage with ownership. And so we want to make sure that the system that we set up is designed to allow your board to function as the leaders that they're actually supposed to be. We also see a lot with this challenges around like a lack of accountability structure. So not in a punitive way, but just no follow-up if somebody misses a meeting, or not having a really solid shared understanding of what their participation should actually look like. And over time that can create kind of a quiet drift. It's not intentional, it's just unstructured. And to be really clear, when I'm talking about accountability with board members, this is not about policing people. This is not about punishing people or trying to, take into account. It's just about making those expectations really visible and consistent. I think, board members most of the time are volunteers. They usually have full-time jobs, families, and about 37 other different commitments that are competing for their attention. And that means that we have to be able to help them meet our expectations so that they can be successful. So don't think about building in accountability mechanisms as a way to punish folks for doing something wrong. Just think of it as a way that, a tool essentially that we could use to support their own goal of being a strong board member. And then another thing that tends to contribute to this a lot, and
Morgan, really quickly, a question for you about what you just mentioned. So when you're talking, I love what you're talking about with kind of ownership and making sure that they have some things to do, but then also noting that they do have, lives and full-time jobs typically, and these other responsibilities. How do you find the right balance there, and how do you structure that in a way that typically makes sense to help with that?
That's a great question. I think, one of the things that I've seen folks do that has been really successful is to set up a system of shared expectations that separate what is the bare minimum expectation that you must do in order to remain a member of this board. What is the sort of, this is what you should be doing, this is what we would encourage, this is what we would consider to be like a good, healthy contribution, this is where we sort of hope everybody is, but I understand that sometimes maybe we're going to be closer to that minimum side, in certain cases. And then what is a like leadership level contribution that is above and beyond, that's amazing, right? And having that shared understanding between those three levels can be really helpful for folks, because then we start to understand, like, this is like the point at which I need to consider stepping back from the board because I can't do this, right? I can't meet even the bare minimum. And then also understanding more than just having everybody functioning at a minimum level, here's where ideally we will all be. And I think having the understanding between those sort of 3 different levels is really helpful for folks to understand where they're at, how they're functioning, and making sure that we're all on the same page about whether or not we're meeting expectations. Because usually when I see that sort of frustration happening, it's because not everybody's on the same page about that. So hopefully that's helpful. But yes, and I think, one of the other things that can lead to board disengagement too is when we have sometimes staff or executive directors or leadership, but staff in general has sort of learned to do everything themselves. And so the board is not really being engaged because the leader is doing everything. And usually that's happened for one of a couple of reasons. Either it's because they've been put into a situation in the past where they were forced to do that in order for the organization to function, and the pattern has just sort of continued. Or, it's because they are sort of trying to proactively make things easier for their board members. But either way, right, it results in a leader who is setting the agenda, leading the meetings, and driving all of the decisions, and a board that is just reacting instead of truly participating and leading, which is not ideal. And that's not the reason that your board exists. And, in a system like that, things do typically get done, but staff tend to be really frustrated. And it also teaches the board that they don't have to lead. And as long as that's true, they're not going to do that. And so as you start seeing those patterns, the question begins to shift. It's not like, how do we get people to engage? It's, what do we need to redesign so that engagement actually makes sense? And so I'm happy to offer kind of a few things that I've seen. We talked about kind of the 3 levels of participation and having a shared understanding around what those things are. I think also, and we had a question that was specifically around committee engagement too, that came in during the registration. And I think if you look at redesigning committees around outcomes, not just what they're called, but what they produce, right? Because if we say fundraising committee, well, sure, that tells me that you're in charge of raising money, but that doesn't really say anything super specific. But if we can say more specifically, this group is responsible for identifying 10 new qualified prospects by Q3. That's something that's real for your members to engage with and to accomplish and to do. Make sure that your board meetings are not devoted mostly to updates. Use them for real work. So if it's just updates and giving people information, engagement is always going to be low. Send that stuff out ahead of time. Use the time that you're in the room together for decisions, have discussions, like talk about strategy, right? That's where engagement really lives. Give people more than one way to contribute, right? Like not everybody's going to engage in the same way, and that's okay. That's why we have a board instead of just one single person. Some people are connectors, some people are thinkers, some people are doers. But everybody should have a clear and meaningful way to contribute. And I think also just remembering too with this that engagement levels are never going to be perfectly even across your entire board. And that's something that's okay, right? Some people are like me, right? We are just chronic volunteers. We are naturally inclined to take on more than other people are. And that is okay. We just need to make sure that everybody understands the baseline. Because what we want to avoid is having anybody starting to feel resentful and having anybody feel like the expectations are just shifting constantly underneath of them. We want to create that clarity about what is required, and anything that is sort of going beyond that is a choice and not an obligation, so that we can all feel good about how we're contributing. And also just, setting expectations early, ideally prior to even recruiting someone for the board, the expectations are clear. I think we had some questions about that as well that we can talk about in a moment, but I do think it's worth noting that oftentimes engagement problems can start before somebody even starts to join the board. So I think if I could leave you with one thing around board engagement, it doesn't come from asking people to try harder. It comes from really designing a system where your board members' time and their input and their participation really matter. And when that is happening, you don't have to chase engagement. It starts to really show up on its own. It's never going to be perfect, but hopefully it is. It's consistent. Let's see. Do we have any comments or questions happening in the chat here? Or do we want to go on to recruitment, or what do you think, Levon? What's most helpful?
Yeah, so I liked what Kimberly asked of everyone, just to kind of provide their board size and kind of how often they're meeting, because I think, it obviously can vary, but it's interesting to hear that they're potentially trying a meeting cadence of every other month to see if that can kind of maybe spark some re-engagement. It sounds like they have a pretty decent sized board with 22 members, with some of them being active, some not so much. So it'll be interesting to see how that happens, but I'm just curious if anyone has things that they've done with their board. Sorry for my pup in the background. For their board that's worked, where they've kind of maybe struggled with engagement in the past, that might have some advice for Kimberly. And if not, that's totally fine. We can move on. I just wanted to throw it out there. I know we've gotten a lot of good insight from Morgan already. And it'll be interesting to see if the meeting cadence change helps too. Awesome.
Well, do we want to talk about recruitment and leadership development? Maybe we had some questions. I think we had one from Joylene about recruiting new board members. Monica had asked about preparing people for leadership. And there was Elizabeth had asked about onboarding new folks. So I want to start with a little bit of a reframe around recruitment and leadership development, because those are not separate issues. When I hear questions about recruitment and leadership development and succession planning, those are really two sides of the same question. Recruitment is really about designing the board that you need. Leadership development is about whether that design is actually working over time. So if we think about recruitment, this is a very common question that I get when I'm working with boards. Where do we find new board members? How do we know who needs to be on our board? Most organizations are recruiting board members kind of based on who they know, who says yes, right? That's very human. That's how a lot of people build anything. But recruitment isn't just about filling seats. And I think that's something that's more folks need to hear than realize it. You have 22 members, but if only half of them have ever engaged, do you really need 22 board members? Maybe you don't. Maybe you need 11, and that would be sufficient to meet your needs, because that is where nature is taking you, right? That's where you're functioning. And so maybe, instead of trying to chase down that full-size board, it's also worth saying maybe we just don't need all these people anymore, right? And that is that's worth considering. Sometimes it's worth asking questions like that. But think about, not just like, how do we get butts in seats, but who do we really need right now? Like, who are the people that are going to add to the organization and help us reach our goals in this moment, at this stage of our organization? And what are the gaps? Sort of what perspectives are missing, or which ones are overrepresented? Tools like a board recruitment matrix can be really helpful, just to kind of make those things visible, to help you guide your outreach a little bit more intentionally. We've got one of those in the resources for you to download. But one thing that has been really transformational for boards that I've worked with is to go beyond just skills and demographics, which are important, but also look at what I call transformational leadership categories. And when I started exploring this idea, this came out of a board source publication called Reimagining Boards for High Impact, which is great. And I think I've got that actually in the resources as well. But it asks us to consider whether the board as a whole has this range of leadership functions that it needs to actually navigate the work. And so there are 4 categories that they talk about, one being issue knowers. And so those are people who really deeply understand the problem that your organization exists to address. These are the folks that are bringing context and lived experience and grounding in reality. Then there are resource controllers, and this is one that boards tend to have a lot of emphasis on getting, understandably. People who bring access to funding and influence and relationships and that kind of institutional credibility. These are the folks that are, helping us to not only amass resources, but open doors and really move things forward. And then we have folks who are innovators or problem solvers, people who take information, they turn it into a strategy, and they're really good about challenging assumptions and generating ideas and helping the organization to adapt. And then finally, and this is one that I think we don't see as often on boards as we should, but integrators and networkers. So people who connect everything. So they are the ones who are helping to build relationships, align stakeholders, helping navigate conflict, making sure that everything is actually holding together. And so boards oftentimes will find they have over-indexed in one or two of those areas. And so you have a board that's sort of strong in resources, but weak in community understanding or credibility. Maybe there's one that understands the issue very deeply, but they're not, they're struggling to act a little bit because they maybe don't have the resources that they need in order to do that, or the connections. Maybe you've got one that has lots and lots of really great ideas, but they can't actually implement them because nothing is truly aligned. And then we start to call that an engagement problem when it's really just a capacity problem. And so I think, the important thing to remember, whether you're talking about transformational leadership categories or skills or demographics, it's not necessarily something that you need to treat as a checklist where you're trying to fill everything one to one. You don't need to just try to recruit one of each and call it good, right? We're designing for this sort of collective capacity where one person might span multiple categories. Maybe we have lots of people who are contributing to the same one. Also, hopefully you don't have the same board members that are making up your board for years and years. So the balance is going to shift over time, and your needs are going to shift over time, right? It's not a checklist, it's a system. But when you start thinking about recruitment in that way, the question can change from not just who do we know, but what is our board missing in the way that it functions. So that's something that I think can be a really useful and exciting and new way to think about the folks that we're bringing onto the board. That can make a huge difference, in just small and incremental steps. In terms of recruitment, that's a new idea that I've been thinking about and exploring with clients that has been really, really transformational and I think pretty exciting as well. And let's see, do we have any questions on that one?
Yeah, that is really interesting, Morgan. And honestly, I'm a little shook by the whole concept of maybe you don't need to fill your board with as many folks. Maybe it truly is focusing your attention on however many are there, showing up regularly and participating. Man, that in and of itself is interesting concept. Okay. But I did go ahead and share your article about the transformational leadership as well. I thought that was really impactful. I know we'll share all those resources at the end too, but I think that's interesting. And I'm curious, one of the things that I think this was a really good segue. One of the things that we were kind of talking about is setting those expectations from the beginning. How do you see those working into recruitment and onboarding as well to make sure that you are setting those engagement expectations from the start?
Yes. This is something that I see all the time. If this has never happened in your board before, I will be very shocked. Frankly, is that we have to remember onboarding doesn't start when somebody joins the board. It needs to start during recruitment. And a lot of what happens in organizations is that we tend to downplay expectations to get people in the door. We say things when we're talking to people, trying to get them to join the board, oh, it's not really a huge lift, right? You just have to come to meetings once a month, and there's just a little bit of work in between. You can do what you can. We just appreciate you being here, right? And that is great, and it makes people feel really comfortable joining the board. And then we get very frustrated 6 months later when they do exactly what we told them that they could do as a board member, right? And that's not a people problem. That's a clarity problem. And so I think part of building a strong board, even though it's difficult, is to be really honest really early about what the role actually requires, and not just what it, how it could be okay if they did that, but what does the participation need to look like if the board is functioning ideally for you, right? How do we really want people to be contributing when they join our board? And telling them that, because when expectations are clear on that front end, the engagement piece and the participation piece is much easier on the back end, right? If you tell people that they never have to do anything to be on your board, they're going to join your board thinking that that's okay. And then they're going to be like, well, why are you telling me I have to do all this stuff now? I can't do all that. You told me I didn't have to do that, right? And so we want to be honest with them. And so sometimes that is saying, yeah, it is a commitment. It is also really fulfilling and exciting. And there are a lot of great things that are going to come to you from this, but there are requirements, or expectations. And we should say that before folks start applying, because then we're going to attract the right people.
Yeah. That feels, yes, I love that. And I'm so guilty of that. I've definitely had those conversations before, right? Where I'm like, oh, it'll be so simple, like join, it's just, a couple hours a month or whatever. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Setting those expectations from the start, that transparency will, I think, just naturally kind of help you find that right fit better, which is hard to think about, because sometimes it is about like bringing people to the table, and that just feels, kind of the urgency of doing that. But I totally understand what you're saying. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes. And, this is not to say that you should only have a board of one person, but in many states, the minimum number of board members that your nonprofit needs in order to be a nonprofit is one. Now, of course, the issue is bigger than that, right? And you have your bylaws can be changed. Your bylaws might say you need 75 board members. You probably don't. So, you can look at that, but think about how many board members do you really need? And then work on finding those people that really, truly meet the needs of your organization at this moment in time, right? You probably don't need 75 people, but you do need probably 5 that contribute really well, right? Because either way, you might have 5 that are functioning really well. And so
that's true. And you're spending all of your time trying to manage those other folks and just get that. Yeah, that's true. Kind of wasting that energy. So yeah, that was so helpful. If there's any other questions about that, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, maybe we'll move to fundraising, donor. I know those are always hot topics as well, and I'm sure you can share some excellent expertise about those too.
Yes, absolutely. Fundraising is one that I love talking about, obviously, as a grant writer. And I love working with boards on fundraising. I have a training about fundraising for boards that is always the most fun and the most exciting for board members. Because this is a place where boards tend to feel a lot of pressure. There's not always a lot of clarity. It's a very broad topic as well. So there's a lot of different things that we could cover. I know we had one question specifically around donor retention, like how can we keep our donors coming back? And I think there's a framework that I tell board members to remember. There are 3 things that donors want that board members can deliver. Donors want to see seen and valued. They want to see the impact of their support, and they want to feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves. Those are all things that board members can directly contribute to. And when those 3 things are present, people tend to stick around. So in terms of what that looks like in real life, right? Feeling seen and valued, it doesn't require a huge, massive system. It looks like handwritten thank you notes or a quick phone call after an event to say thank you for coming, which, to be real, actually, I did a project on this once with an organization where they had a large fundraising event and they wanted their board members to do calls. I think it was like 96% of them ended up just leaving voicemails. So it was even easier than the board members expected, because they didn't even have to actually talk to anyone. They just needed to leave a voicemail that said, thank you so much for coming. It was great to have you there. But those sorts of things, or a real conversation, an introduction to someone at an event, or being recognized by somebody when they showed up, right? This is one of those places where board members can really contribute the most. I think that is the level of human interaction and relationship building that takes more time and effort than what your ED or even your DD can realistically contribute for every single person that gives to your organization. And many hands make light work, right? So board members can really be leaders in building and maintaining those relationships. When we're talking about seeing impact, this is connecting their gift to something tangible, not just like, hey, thanks so much for your support, but here's what your support made possible. And we don't want to do that in a way that's inauthentic or over credits our donors for somebody's personal achievements. I think that's important to call out, but sharing real stories about how the support is being used. Invite somebody for a site visit, right? Forward them an internal email about something exciting that happened or a new development of some kind with just a little personal message that says, hey, just want to let you know this is happening. Your gift helped make this possible. But I think, the last one, feeling like you're part of something bigger, that's where some of that engagement comes in. This is probably the most powerful and also least utilized way to keep donors coming back for more. And that's to invite your donors into the work, right? Give them ways to participate beyond just giving. And, you can do that in a lot of ways. You can ask them to do something that will help your organization. Will they participate on an advisory committee? Would they be willing to serve as a table host at your next fundraiser? Hey, would you mind writing or editing our next blog post on the website or the next newsletter? Another really powerful one has been, would you be willing to join us at a meeting with a funder that we're going to be meeting with soon to show your support? Or we have a meeting with an elected official to talk about some things. Would you be willing to join to show your support with us? Giving folks an opportunity to feel more than just warm fuzzies about your organization, but to really feel like they are part of your team, and not just their wallet, but them as a person. People will keep giving to a relationship that they feel truly connected to. And that's also something, this is a place where something like the 7 donor types can be really helpful to understand, which I've put in those resources as well. Not all donors are motivated by the same thing. Some of them care about the impact in the data. Some of them care about, the community. Some of them care about their legacy. Some of them care about their connections with others. Some of them care about the visibilities of their gift. So, if we're using the same sort of message and the same approach for everybody, you're probably missing the mark. I think, good fundraising, it's not just about telling your story. It's about understanding their story and really being able to meet them there. And that's something that board members can absolutely do. It's very, very helpful. Levon, I love you're an introvert. Me too. I'm like typical millennial. I hate being on the phone. Oh, and look, Kimberly, this is amazing.
I like what you shared about understanding their story too. I wonder, like, I often don't think about leaning into kind of the board member, like why did they join? Why did they feel passionate about joining, and helping the organization? Maybe their story could potentially help kind of with that as well. And I wouldn't have necessarily thought of that. So I appreciate that perspective.
Absolutely. I think that's something that some of the most powerful fundraising appeals, we always think about, we want to tell client stories and we have to show the impact story for, these folks that we're supporting. And really, oftentimes the most powerful appeals are not from the folks that we support, they're from the people that give to us. And they tell the story of, this is why I give, this is why I support this is why this is important to me, because donors see themselves in those stories and they attract more donors. Right. So it's not just, oh, wow, that's amazing. But it's like, wow, yes, that's me too. So I'm going to join you. I'm going to also make a gift. And I think it's something that we don't ask for often enough, but it is so, so powerful when we do. Yes, David, absolutely. This is so, had somebody who cannot ask for money directly, but could and did send personal thank you notes. Absolutely. There are so many different ways that board members can and should be contributing, right? And I think, when we talk about fundraising systems on boards, we tend to focus a lot on how much do you have to give if you're a board member, or like what's the give or get policy, right? Like, what is sort of this like requirement of you that's focused on a dollar amount of some kind. Organizations, I mean, they handle this sort of thing, in terms of fundraising support in different ways. I don't love minimum gift policies. I don't love give or get policies. They can work. They're just not my favorite. There's a couple reasons why I don't love those. I think when you put a fixed dollar amount on board giving, you risk doing sort of two things at the same time, right? Like one, you might be excluding people from leadership who don't have capacity to give or to raise at that level. You also might unintentionally sort of cap what somebody might have given if they weren't anchoring to that number. I think, instead of anchoring to a number, I think what's much more powerful is anchoring to meaning. One of the ways that I have heard that framed, and this comes from a really incredible fundraiser that I took a workshop from, her name is Liz Farr, it is the idea of asking board members as a matter of policy to make a gift that is sacrificial to them. And I really love that language. Sometimes you hear like, oh, give something that's comfortable for you. No, she used the word sacrificial because for me, that shifts the question from what do I have to give to what would it look like for me to give in a way that actually matters, both to the organization, but also to myself. And that's a very different posture. It's not about obligation. It's not about checking a box. It's about alignment, right? Do I believe in this work enough to invest in it personally in a way that is meaningful to me, right? It gets right at the heart of what that means to be building a culture of giving or a culture of philanthropy on your board. And I think, once you make that shift, that is when that second issue with give or get starts to show up a lot more clearly, because policies like those, for me, and again, if they work for you, that's great. But for me, they tend to reduce fundraising down to a transaction, right? They send the message that your goal is just to sort of hit a specific number instead of recognizing all of those different ways that board members can contribute. Because fundraising at its core is relationship building, right? Not everybody is going to play the same role in that process. And this gets exactly back to what David was talking about, right? That some folks are connectors. Some people are storytellers. Some people are comfortable making the ask, but we want all of our board members to have a way to contribute. And I think a really good fundraising system is one that makes space for all of those different types of contributions and emphasizes how important they are. And I think, in terms of operationalizing that, one of the best ways to do that and the simplest ways is just to get really clear about what individual commitments are, not just like everybody needs to raise X number of dollars, but here are all the different ways that we have available for you to engage in fundraising. What are you going to commit to for this year? And then having that as part of that accountability system we talked about at the beginning, that could be making a certain number of introductions or, hosting a small gathering of friends to introduce the organization to them, not even with an ask necessarily, but just a, hey, I want to tell you about this organization that I'm involved with and passionate about and all of the exciting things that are happening. Invite your executive director and ask them to ask for the money at the gathering if you want to do it that way, right? And like, you can write thank you notes, you can join donor meetings, you can, be in charge of stewarding relationships over time. And when you ask folks to sort of select which are, these are all of the different ways that I feel like I can contribute, you've got a system that it's structured and it's flexible, it's clear, but it's not one size fits all. So I think it's not about fundraising and boards. It's not about controlling how people give or what they do. It's about creating a system where people understand their role, they feel like they can contribute in meaningful ways, and fundraising becomes something that the whole board truly can participate in and take ownership of, and not just a few people. Because ideally fundraising, we don't want it to be a requirement so much as like a shared expression of our belief in the work as the trustees of the organization, which is so important and so powerful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I actually like what David just shared in the chat about kind of, let's talk through the math. Like, let's have that transparent conversation of how do we make this work? And I think that just naturally makes those conversations come up and really encourages people to think outside the box of how you can make all of that work. So I love that recommendation. And I think that's interesting. Anything else around this topic that you think would be important to kind of touch on? Any other questions? Otherwise, I know I know there's so much. And you could probably talk for the rest of the time on that.
Literally all day. No, I, David, that is such a great point. And one of the things that I advise boards to do that is a little bit more, it's an amount, but set a board specific fundraising goal. So not like as a board, we all need to give up to like $20,000, but like together as a board this year, like we see that our expected revenue this year is $1 million. And as a board, we are committing to raising $40,000 of that. That we will personally make sure that 40,000 of those dollars come in the door. And then as a board through the year, this is an objective that you have set as a team together. You have deployed people to do different parts of the tasks that need to be done in order to make that happen. But you can then look back at the end of the year and say, here's what we were able to specifically contribute. And I think that can also be really powerful for board members and for organizations for a number of reasons. But that can be helpful if you've struggled a little bit with that. It's like, say, don't say each person does this. Put a number on the board as a whole and say, we're going to figure out together how to get there and we're going to make it happen.
I really like that. I love that, because then it creates kind of that team mentality, and it really kind of naturally like calls out people's different talents to reach that without it necessarily being tied to those individual dollar goals. I love that.
Yes, exactly. It's key, right? Because the money doesn't just come from anywhere. Every development director at some point gets frustrated with their board because they think the board is like, just raise more money. And they're like, they have no idea what goes into it. So when you can really get the board involved, they do begin to understand that. And also, they begin to become a meaningful part of achieving the goal that they've set, which is huge. It's huge. What else do we have, LaVon?
So there was one thing I was going to bring up really quickly, and we kind of mentioned it farther back when we were just briefly mentioned bylaws. Can we talk a little bit about governance, and how often do you recommend kind of looking at those important documents, like by reviewing those bylaws and things like that?
Yes. Okay. So, I mean, the answer to that can vary based on your organization. As a very quick nuts and bolts answer, but don't stop listening when I stop saying this. Generally speaking, try to do a comprehensive review, like every 2 to 3 years, and then smaller, more targeted updates in between. But bylaws are not meant to be a static document that you write once and then forget about until 3 years from now when you have to go back and review them again, right? They are a tool that is supposed to reflect how your board actually functions. Ideally, your board members will have your bylaws open in a tab during board meetings. They will actually be referring to them during discussions as a tool for their decision making and the process, and what are we doing? And so for me, it is not so much like what the interval frequency of the review is, but whether or not your board is consistently able to make good decisions at the right level in the right way, right? Instead of asking like, when was the last time we reviewed our bylaws, but maybe asking like, where are we feeling friction in how our board operates? And is that an indication that we need to go in and do some review or revisit our governance structure in some way? So like, yes, have the formal check-in scheduled, but also more importantly than that, remember that if your bylaws are not useful as a tool throughout every month of the year, they're not really governing anything. And so use them as a tool, please. Don't let them just sit in the Google Drive until the next time it pops up on your calendar to look through them, because they should be useful.
Yeah. No, and that's a good point, though, to look more for those friction points instead of just reviewing for reviewing's sake. Like, what are those things that you're running into time and time again that really do need to be addressed? Feel free to add in any other questions in the chat if we haven't touched on something that's top of mind, for sure. Otherwise, yeah, this is great.
Good. Yeah, I know. I mean, there was a lot of questions that we received. I'm trying to think if there are any like really quick and dirty ones to make sure that we get. Somebody had asked about, is it okay to talk informally in between board meetings? Like, yes, with caveats. Boards are made up of humans. Humans talk to each other. They're going to share ideas, ask questions. bounce things off of each other. That's not just normal. That's helpful. That is an indication that your board is engaged. But we also, the line to sort of pay attention to there is like, are you brainstorming or are you making decisions, even if that's an informal level? Because governance decisions have to be made in a way that's transparent. It's documented, it's inclusive of the full board. A lot of states have sunshine laws that your duty of obedience requires you to follow. So you want to be careful. I think informal conversations are really great for exploring ideas and, kind of preparing for discussions. But they shouldn't replace that formal decision-making process. And the other layer that can get kind of tricky there, right, is that if too many decisions are sort of effectively being made inside conversations, even if that decision is not made official until the board meeting, you can really begin to create a dynamic where not everybody on the board has equal access to information or influence. And that's when governance starts to drift and your board will begin to include a really unhealthy dynamic, not because you intended for that to happen, but just because the process isn't visible. So it's a subtle line, but it's an important one. Like, yes to engaging between meetings, but no to back channeling would be something that I would say for sure. Let's see. Dual relationships that board members carry. And I'm not exactly sure about what the question with that is. So if you would not mind to maybe elaborate a little bit, and you're welcome. I think you can come off mute, right, Levon? Folks can.
Yeah, absolutely. If it's easier to just come off mute and chat that way, feel free.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. So we have a board, actually one or two board members who serve on multiple boards. So I think the element of conversation and how to address that at times when you feel as if they're kind of saving an idea or something, fundraising for the other group and not our group. Kind of that issue, and then the rest of that was kind of getting into. Then we have another board member who works. Their primary job. They actually work for another nonprofit. So again, they may be saving, certain abilities and resources for their primary job itself.
So that's tricky. That is tough. And I think, this is one reason why one of my mentors, Dr. Bev Browning, she says nobody should ever be serving on more than one board at once. Because for this exact reason, she feels like it's too easy to violate your duty of loyalty if you have split interests in that way. Because if you're saving one thing for somebody over another or whatever, you're not putting the organization above yourself and your other interests because you just can't. I wouldn't, go so far as to say like nobody can ever be on more than one board at once. But it's worth examining if that is something that's happening a lot, if maybe it's not the right time to be on both boards. It's trickier when someone is their job is at another nonprofit. I will say, the function of a board member versus a staff member is different. Our board is supposed to be focused on long-term, big picture sustainability, things that are happening in the future versus more day-to-day, like being in the weeds sort of strategy, which is what our staff is there to do. And so ideally, if somebody's functioning as staff in one organization, their role there is much different from what their role as a board member is if they're both organizations are functioning healthily. And so I think that's a little bit easier to navigate. But at the end of the day, you have a duty of loyalty for a reason. It's a fiduciary duty, it's a legal and ethical duty. And so you can't save things for one or another or, prefer one or another. If you're doing that and you find yourself doing that, then you got to resign from one of those boards because, ultimately you're not able to fulfill your duties. And so that's a sign that it's time to step back from one, I think. Yes, Kimberly. So if somebody is trying to have a one-on-one touch point with individual board members, what would I say should or should not be discussed during these times? I think for me, when I see that happening, which I think is a great idea, think of it as not a performance review, but sort of a performance check-in. How does the board member feel like things are going? Are they participating? You know, is their experience the board member meeting what they thought, you know, what they hoped for when they joined? What could we be doing, you know, either as the rest of the board or just as an organization in general to support you in being successful? You know, what are, you know, those observations that you have that maybe, you know, you haven't had space to bring up during a board meeting, or, you know, for whatever reason, you know, you haven't felt like you could. Getting some of those insights and bringing them, you know, one-on-one conversations are can be really powerful and are important. You know, don't use that opportunity to complain and just back channel. Again, you know, it's back channeling is where you get in trouble. Is, you know, if there's this sort of like group of people who are doing all the things in practice, and the rest of the board is just rubber stamping, well, then now we're not fulfilling our duty of care as a board. So we've got another problem there. And so it's not about like, let's just make decisions that we're just going to ask everybody to sign off on later. But, you know, talk about like functioning and dynamics, both individually and as a group, and ideas and generation. And yeah, just try to walk that line.
The other thing,
but
the other thing that might be helpful in those one-to-one conversations is maybe understanding why they, you know, are supporting the organization, or why they chose to, you know, support this over others, because maybe there's a story there or some ideas, you know, in and of itself, just to see if that might be helpful too, from kind of more of that storytelling perspective. Yeah. Awesome.
absolutely.
Well, this has been so helpful. I'm going to go ahead really quickly, Morgan, and I'm going to share the resources that you provided. If there's any that you want to talk through, or just kind of give high level of kind of what you were thinking with these, and we will share these as a follow-up. So as a reminder, the recording will come right after we finish this conversation, but as a separate follow-up, we'll also send these resources that Morgan provided.
Yes, absolutely. I think we touched on most of these during our time. The first one is a blog post that I wrote about improving board engagement and some of those systems that we talked about, because this is such a common question, not just for this group, but for every board. There's that reimagining boards for high impact and the transformational leadership categories. There's a board recruitment matrix that includes those transformational leadership categories that you can grab from my website. There's a publication. Susan Howlett has a book called Boards on Fire, which if you've not read it, whether you are a board member or an executive director, you should go get it. It's like very, very skinny. It's very thin. It's a very fast read, but it is one of the most impactful things that you will read if you are looking to have a board that supports fundraising. And one of the things that is in there, this is kind of like a supplemental resource, is about the 7 donor types and understanding what they are, what their motivations are. And then there's also a board fundraising commitment form that I provide and use with my clients that they have found useful. So you can download those. There's lots more different tools and things. So you're more than welcome to visit my website to find those. And folks are also more than welcome to connect with me via email, or connect with me on LinkedIn too. I share things there quite frequently as well. But yeah, hopefully these will be helpful in going forward with some of the things that we talked about today.
Awesome. This has been so helpful. Thank you so much, Morgan. Thank you everyone for joining us, providing the questions ahead of time, but also just the great conversation as we went through. This has been really, really insightful. So appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day. Again, we'll send out the recording immediately following, and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for coming, everyone.